With that, we are kicking off this morning my final little series as a pastor of this church. And so for those of you who don't know, my successor is coming. Jonathan Walton will be here in a number of weeks. And when you get close to your end of things, you start getting emotions. You start getting feelings about what you're passing on. If you've ever spent some time around someone who's literally passing away toward the end of their life, you'll notice that their priorities change a little bit, right? The things that you're focused on, what you want to do with your last moments, changes a little bit, and your focus is different. And for me, this is kind of that moment. I'm not dying or anything. I'm just moving on to another ministry. But it is there's a little bit of loss, right? There's a little bit of those feelings. And so what I'm going to do over the next 3 weeks is we're going to share some final thoughts with y'all as a church I dearly love. But I'm going to do so through the final last words of three important figures in the Bible. First with Moses, then with Jesus, and then with the Apostle Paul. But in each of those cases, all three of those guys, they have a story to share. They have some words as they are leaving, and they're a little bit different, each of them, but I think within them contain many of the things that I would want to leave with you as I leave. And so for these final 3 weeks, we're going to look at these three figures and share their last words. And this morning, we're going to start with the oldest of them, my dear friend Moses. And for those of you who don't know your Bible very well, this is going to be maybe a little bit of the hardest one because we don't all know it a lot about Moses. But Moses is a very, very significant figure in the Bible. He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, so that's kind of important. But he has, in the very, very end of the book of Deuteronomy, there's his final activities. And there's a song that he sings and leads, and it's beautiful. It's very rich and flowing. We're skipping the song. I'm sorry, I'm not Lord of the Rings. I skip the songs. That's how I am. There is a final blessing that he gives to the nation. We're going to skip that part. But right before those two things, he has a final message, a teaching or an encouragement there to the nation of Israel as he is going. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. So if you have a Bible, let me encourage you to open up to Deuteronomy chapter 31. You can go to the very end and then just back a couple chapters. And this passage here is his final words to his people. It is his final encouragement. He knows his days are short, and he has some very valuable things to say to us that would be the same things that as the pastor who's leaving, I'd want to share with you. And so we're going to look at this morning and be encouraged and be challenged. And it starts out like this, okay? So Moses went, and he spoke these words to all of Israel. And he said to them, I am 120 years old today. I am no longer able to go out and come in, and the Lord has told me, you shall not cross this Jordan. And I read that, and some of you are looking around like, what does that mean exactly? That doesn't feel like it's a full thing. And really, our response to this little snippet that Moses is starting to speak here, depending on our knowledge of Moses, can elicit very, very different responses. Some of you know Moses and his story and know your Bible really, really well, and you read this phrase, you shall not cross the Jordan, and that means a whole lot to you. Others, you've heard of Moses, but you don't know much about him. In fact, I remember when I first went to Bible school, my wife and I were driving across the country to go to this little Bible school, and I was having second thoughts about going to Bible school. I was 20 years old, and like, hey, should I really be going to Bible school or not? And she asked, well, do you know about Moses? Like, yeah, he's some guy in the Old Testament. I think it's important, but I didn't have any idea who Moses was. And she's like, I think Bible school is going to be a good thing for you because I didn't grow up going to Sunday school. I didn't know the stories. And so that might be you this morning. You might be a person like, hey, I don't know. I've heard the name, but that's about it. And if that's you, welcome. We're so glad you're here. This will be an interesting morning trying to give you all those details. In fact, my encouragement, if that is you this morning, tomorrow on your day off, you should go watch this movie, The Prince of Egypt. And it is, some folks say it's the greatest animated film of all time. That's not me, that's someone actually did say that, but it is, your pastor's telling you to go watch a movie because this movie is really actually pretty good. It tells you the story of the first half of Moses' life, and it's not some B-movie thing. It's actually like, you'd recognize the voice actors, Sandra Bullock, Patrick Stewart, Steve Martin. Like it's a good movie. If you've not seen it, please go watch it. Just to know the background story of Moses, because it's very, very significant, okay? So there's a little bit of background, but this phrase, "you shall not cross this Jordan," is so significant. And if this was a multi-hour church service, we would watch the movie and then we'd talk about the rest just so you'd have the background, but we're not going to do that today. But I do have to go back and share some of Moses' life story for the significance of this to be apparent, okay? So here's the quick version, the review of Moses' life. And it was a long time ago, so we're going to do it in black and white because it was a long, long time ago. But he was born to Hebrew parents. It's in Egypt though. Okay, so they're living as refugees, the whole camp of the Israelite people. And he's born to Hebrew parents. However, the Egyptians are kind of getting tired of having the Hebrew people there, and so they had their version of the No Child Left Behind Act, which basically meant that they killed all the baby boys, and that way they were not going to have any more childs left behind there in Egypt. And his sister Miriam comes up with this brilliant idea to sneak him into this boat, little floaty basket thing, and float him down the river because she knows where the Egyptian princess does her river stuff, bathing and whatever, and the princess will rescue the baby, and that's exactly what happens. And so Miriam saves Moses' life, and Moses is adopted by this Egyptian princess, and it's not clear if she can't have kids or why exactly she does this, but she does. She adopts Moses, and Moses grows up as an Egyptian prince, as a king. In fact, later on, people look at Moses and assume that he's an Egyptian. He's not Hebrew because he would be dressed like an Egyptian. Okay, so this is Moses. And fast forward a little bit, we meet Moses as a young adult. And there's some slave driver taskmaster beating some Hebrew people, and he knows that he is Hebrew, and he realizes this is wrong, and he bursts out in anger and kills the guy, okay? It's always great when your heroes are murderers. Just think about that a little bit, okay? So he goes out and he kills the Egyptian taskmaster. You're going to find out later in his life that he has a little bit of an anger issue. You're going to meet that about Moses. But much like today, murder doesn't go over well with the ancient authorities. And so he flees, okay? And he runs and goes to another country. Back in those days, it's called Midian. Nowadays, you would call it Saudi Arabia or Arabia there. And so he leaves. And he goes out to Arabia and meets his wife, who is a shepherdess, and they get married, they have kids, and life happily ever after there in Arabia. Except for then suddenly he meets God at the burning bush. And it's very significant. You probably have heard the story before, but he meets the angel of the Lord, and the bush is burning, but the bush isn't burning. It's not being consumed by the fire, it's just glowing there, burning. And Moses approaches the bush to figure out what on earth this is. This is unusual. And God speaks to him, says, "Take off your shoes, you're on holy ground." And so he does. And let's just read a little bit of the original just so you have a feeling for it. It says, the Lord says, "I certainly have seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their outcry because of their taskmasters. For I am aware of their suffering, so I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a land that is good and spacious, to a land flowing with milk and honey." This is Moses' first real interaction with God. And God has basically said, hey, the same way that you got upset and killed that guy, I'm a little upset with these people because of what they've done. And so I've come to do something about it. And what am I going to do about it? I'm going to give them a land flowing with milk and honey. It's the promised land. It's this place that we now call Israel. Some folks want to call it Palestine, but it's this area there in the nation of Israel. And that God is saying, hey, this is the solution to the slavery that my people are in, is I'm going to liberate them, free them, and bring them to this land. That's what Moses' task is. Okay, so he goes back to Egypt, meets his brother, and is assisted by his brother Aaron. And he goes to Pharaoh and tells Pharaoh that God says, "Let my people go." And if you were Pharaoh, how'd that go for you? Not so much. Nope. And so then Moses puts on his shades and begins to unleash the plagues. And so they have this go back and forth, and it's this cosmic battle between the Egyptian gods and these plagues that God delivers through Moses, up to and including the angel of death at the final Passover plague. So super intense. Again, I'm assuming if you've been at church for a while, you've read the stories. If you haven't, you should go read them. They're significant. But eventually, Pharaoh says uncle, and he takes his people, and Moses takes them, and they leave Egypt. Egyptians give them all their whole bunch of good and loot, so they would actually leave. So they start leaving, and Pharaoh says, actually, that was a terrible idea. Let's go kill them. And so he sends off his chariots to go chase down Moses and the Israelites, and very famously, Moses parts the Red Sea, and they march through on dry ground. And it's this amazing miracle. And then the sea closes back down and washes and drowns the Egyptian army. You've seen the movies, right? Obviously Prince of Egypt has this scene, but maybe animation's not your thing. You may be the 1956 Charlton Heston movie. Anyone? This generation, some of you have seen it. I haven't actually seen this. It's a little too old for what I can handle. But that's just personal. That's where I'm at. Maybe you're not that old. They made new ones though. In 2014, the God and Kings movie from Ridley Scott. You have options. Okay, old film, classic film, new film, animated film. Like this story has been told many times because it's significant. Make sure you know it, okay? You need to know the story of Moses. Okay, but back to my summary. Okay, so they've gone through the Dead Sea. A month later, they're at Mount Sinai, and the whole nation's there. Moses goes up, meets with God. They come down. You've heard of the 10 Commandments before. This is where those get brought in. He carries them back down the mountain, and they kind of do this deal with God. This is God's offer to them. I will bless you beyond all possible blessings if you obey, and if you disobey, you'll be cursed, as bad as it could be. And Israel very quickly says, absolutely, great, sign me up. And that's the problem, right? Because about 3 days later, they're breaking the rules, and thus begins a very long story of this cycle of Israel's disobeying the rules and having consequences and being spurned into doing things right before failing again. They have this cycle that goes on for a couple thousand years. So that's the process. And in this role, Moses is demonstrating some examples of like a type of what Jesus would be like. Because Moses ends up being the one who delivers the law, delivers the truth, shows how things should be done. Then when they don't do it properly, he intercedes on their behalf. He is this, the theologians refer to as the prophet, priest, and king, where he's fulfilling these roles that Jesus would someday take on for us. About 3 months later, the nation, they have now continued their journey across the desert and are up to a location called Kadesh Barnea, and that's on the edge of the Promised Land, which, if you remember, this is where Moses was originally told by God that he was going to take his people to bring them to the Promised Land. So they get up to the Promised Land, and God tells them to send spies out into the Promised Land to check it out. And so this is what God says. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, send out men for yourselves to spy out the land of Canaan, which I'm going to give to the sons of Israel. You shall send a man from each of their fathers' tribes, every one a leader among them. So God's saying this, hey, take every group of people here, take their leaders, and send them out and spy out this land. Let them look at what I am about to give them. It is so amazing. And so they take this 40 days, and they go out and they spy it out. They check out the Promised Land that God had promised. Again, this has only been 3 months since they walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. Okay, it's not been that long. They had a little stopover at Mount Sinai where they saw God, and this whole time there's been a pillar of cloud by day and a column of fire by night as God's presence was with them as they traveled through. Okay, so they've been seeing miraculous every day. It's no longer even miraculous, it's just normal. Okay, but they get to the Canaan and they head in, they spy it out, and the spies get back 40 days later, and this is what the spies are saying. They report to Moses and say, we came into the land which you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. And they handed them some big grape thing that was like some amazing fruit. But nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And so this is what the spies basically, they come back and say, hey, it's really awesome. It's really great. It's everything you've ever promised us, but it's going to be hard. Like, it's going to be challenging to actually take. And of the spies that go in, 10 are basically saying this, hey, this is going to be really, really hard. The other 2 guys say, hey, we can do this, okay? So here's the responses of the 2 groups of people when they tell all the people. It says, all the congregation, the nation of Israel, they raised their voices and cry out, and the people wept that night. And the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the entire congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. Why, guys? Why would you do that? But why do we go back to things that enslave us rather than pursue freedom? We do it all the time, okay? There's no difference, okay? They're just saying it out loud. So they're thinking, hey, we should go back to Egypt. In fact, they say so. Verse 4, they looked at one another. Let's appoint a leader and return to Egypt. Let's go back to slavery. It's much easier to be slaves than to trust something we cannot see, to trust God who is he going to deliver us? We don't know. And so this is the nations of Israel's challenge, which is, it's our challenge. It's all of humanity's challenge. Hey, are we going to go back to Egypt? Are we going to trust God? And this is the backstory for what Moses is presenting here this morning. Joshua and Caleb, they step it up a little bit. They are the ones who spied out the land. They tore the clothes and they spoke to the congregation saying, the land which we passed through to spy was exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, then he'll bring us into this land and give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. Here you have these amazing leaders, which is why God said, send leaders, okay, when you do the spying. But these leaders just stand up and saying, hey, people, it's going to be hard, but it's good, and God has us. We can do this. And so, right, the moral of the story is all the people rally behind these leaders, and they go charging into the promised land. They win, right? Happily ever after. Some of you have read the story, haven't you? Okay. It doesn't actually go that way. Not even all. What really actually happens is the people pick up rocks to murder Joshua and Caleb, because they don't want any of this leadership. They want to go back to Egypt. They're kind of serious. And so they get down, they pick up the stones to kill these 2 leaders, and God appears in their midst. God himself appears in their midst and basically says, hey, Moses, should we just kill all these guys and start over? Because this is not working, right? It's serious. Why? They have been seeing all the miracles. They've seen all the plagues. They saw the Red Sea. They saw all this stuff, but yet they rejected God. And Moses does exactly what Jesus does for us. He says, don't. Forgive them. They've sinned. They don't know what they're doing. And think of what the Egyptians are going to think if this is what you do. And so God, of course, that whole conversation that Moses has with God was designed for us to recognize how Jesus is going to intercede for you and I. Folks, we're going to do stupid stuff. Okay, we're going to. And Jesus is there to intercede on our behalf in the same way. And so, however, there's consequences. And the consequences for the nation of Israel, that generation of people who saw all the miracles but then rejected God, is that they're cursed to wander the desert for 40 years. 1 year for every year, for every month, or every day they were out spying for 40 years. And that generation of older folks that wasn't going to trust God, they weren't going to go to the promised land. The only people who were going to go to the promised land were the younger generation and the folks who had been faithful. Caleb and Joshua and Moses, and there's probably others, but basically the folks who were being faithful were allowed to live to make it to the promised land, and those who weren't were going to all die, and it was going to take 40 years. And so for 40 years, they wander around in the desert, and some things happen during those 40 years. The nation fails in faith, so they stuck with the 40 years. But during this time, there's like the manna story. Bread, every morning they woke up and bread just magically appeared. And so they called it manna, and which I think is why we all want donuts in the morning for breakfast. That's a little thing with my kids and I. But so we want manna for breakfast. The people got thirsty. They started grumbling because, a little pro tip in life, People will always grumble, no matter what you do, okay? So they grumble. And Moses, and God has this program where Moses is going to do this big object lesson to teach them about, again, teach us about things that are going to happen. So God tells Moses to go to this rock and to strike it. And by doing so, it'll release water and they'll have something to drink. And again, there's a significance to that story. In fact, you read Paul talking about it, basically saying that, hey, Christ represents that rock, and that the rock was struck and out of it came living water, life. And so we have this imagery of how Jesus was going to be stricken, and from that produced life for all of us. There's all this metaphor and imagery that God is taking this time to teach us. But guess what? People, they start grumbling again, because life pro tip, people will always grumble and complain. But they show up to Moses once again and say, hey, we're thirsty again. And at this point, Moses is just about had it with these guys. And again, if I was Moses, I would have probably had it a long time ago with them. But Moses is, and again, he has a little bit of an anger issue, as we saw earlier in his life. And so in a moment of anger, in a moment where he knew what he was supposed to do, because God said, speak to the rock, and water will come out. But instead, in his anger, he hits the rock again. You're like, well, why is that so significant? Well, Jesus only needed to be struck once. That's the significance of why God did not want him striking the rock again, because it kind of messes up the object lesson. But God basically, he strikes the rock, water comes out, and God meets with Moses and says, hey, because of your disobedience, you are not going to enter the promised land. You're not going to make it because of that one little bit of disobedience. And how much disobedience does it take for us to offend God? Well, any amount is sufficient. Like when God's gracious with us, he's being gracious with us. And God had been gracious with Moses, but Moses had finally let his human side succumb to it. Okay, so as a result of this sin, Moses is not entering into the promised land. So you end up with this imagery of crossing the Jordan. What does crossing the Jordan mean? It means to enter the promised land. For the Exodus generation, they missed out on it because of a failure of trust, because they did not believe that God, who rescued them out of Egypt, was strong enough to rescue them and to give them, to beat all these strong cities and people. They couldn't do it. So they missed out on crossing Jordan because of a lack of trust. And Moses missed out on the promised land because of a lack of obedience. Like Moses knew that God existed, okay? He saw him face to face up on the mountain. But just because you see God face to face on the mountain, just because you are a pastor or a missionary, some amazing person, and you know God's real, doesn't mean that you can't fail in obedience. We all can. Everyone can. We can choose to obey or not. And then the example of what does take to enter the promised land is Caleb and Joshua. And they trusted God and they obeyed God. And that's the model for what we should be doing, is to trust and obey. Okay, so that's the significance when he says, the Lord has told me you shall not cross this Jordan. Moses is being reminded of the last 40 years of this warning, this encouragement of what does this next generation need to know and hear in order to experience the promised land, in order to not repeat the failures of Kadesh Barnea, how to actually make it in there. This is almost like the ultimate case of like the kids in the back of the car saying, hey, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And the parents are like, yes, we're there, and this is what you need to know so it goes okay with you at Disneyland. Or this is what you need to know to be able to survive this trip to grandma's house. Like you give them the last bit of instructions because you have finally arrived after 40 years. And here's what Moses tells these guys. It says, it is the Lord your God who's going to cross ahead of you, for he himself will destroy these nations before you, and you shall dispossess them. Joshua is the one who's going to cross ahead of you, just as the Lord has spoken. And the Lord will do to them just as he did to Shinan and Og and the kings of the Amorites and to their land when he destroyed them. There's military aspects of this whole story. The Lord will turn them over to you, and you will do to them in accordance to all the commandments which I have commanded you. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or dread of them, for the Lord your God is the one who is going with you. He will not desert you or abandon you. Then Moses called Joshua and said to him in the sight of all of Israel, be strong and courageous, for you will go with this people into the land that the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give to them, and will give it to them as an inheritance. And the Lord is the one who is going ahead of you. He will be with you. He will not desert you or abandon you. Do not fear and do not be dismayed. Moses tells the nation of Israel in Joshua essentially the same thing. There's three big things that he says to them. Number one, the Lord, he will be with you. God will be with them as they take the promised land. But the truth is, God was with them in all the wanderings. I hope you recognize, literally the pillar of the cloud or the pillar of fire by night, God was with them this whole time. But Moses is saying something a little bit different here. And the truth is, as believers in Christ, God is with you. He will not forsake you. That is true. But that's not what this is talking about. This is talking about and experiencing God in a more intimate way, in a powerful way. Moses is saying to them that God will supernaturally empower you to accomplish the mission that he has called you to. He's with you. He will empower you. And oftentimes in our Christian experience, we know God is with us because we've studied theology, we've read the Bible, God is with us, but we don't actually feel like God is with us. We're missing out on something, right? And this is pointing to why it might be that you feel like you're missing out on something, okay? It's connected to what Moses is saying, that if they are living in faith or trust and obedience on mission, they will experience God in a very tangible way. Number two, it says, he will not desert you or abandon you. And these words mean the first phrase, to be deserted, is to leave in a lurch. It's connected to the idea of something going slack. And it reminds me of out at Bible camp where my wife and I met, there was a rock climbing wall, and they had a belay system where a person kind of pulled you on the rope as you're going up. And their job wasn't to pull you up. For the little kids, we tried to pull them up. But normally the job of the person doing belay was to catch you when you fall. Hey, you fall, and they catch you on the rope. And so that you wanted someone paying attention, though, because if someone wasn't paying attention, you climbed up a whole bunch and they hadn't been pulling the rope. If you fell, you'd have quite a little jolt there at the bottom. And so you wanted someone who was not going slack, who was with you, not deserting you. And so this is what God is offering. Hey, God is not going to go slack. He's not going to ignore you. He's not going to forget about you. He's not going to desert you. The second word here, abandon, is the idea of a spouse abandonment. So your husband or your wife leaves you and you feel abandoned. And God is saying he will not desert you. He won't leave you hanging. And he won't abandon you like a spouse. He's with you. And sometimes it's really easy to think that God has left us. And we're hey, this is not true. God does desert. No, I don't think God leaves us. And you see an example of this in Jesus' story of the prodigal son. Right, the prodigal son, he asks for his inheritance and he goes out and does the party scene. He does it all, and he's very disconnected from his father, not because his father is disconnected toward him, but because he went away. And it's not until he's eating the pig slop does he realize, oh, wait a second, this is dumb. I should go back to my father. And so he does, and when he gets back, his father receives him. And the truth is, God is the same way toward us. When we feel the disconnect, when we feel like God has deserted or abandoned us, it's not that God has gone anywhere. It's almost certainly the case that we have gone someplace and have not returned back to him. God doesn't leave them, that they walk away from God, and they do it a lot. But our experience of intimacy with God as believers is conditioned on two things, right? It's trusting in obedience. That's what drives intimacy with God. When we are wanting to go back to Egypt, when we want to go back to slavery, we want to go back to all the things of the world, that doesn't build intimacy. It's walking away. In fact, one of our enemy's primary methodologies is in this world, in this day and age here in the United States, is distraction. If he can distract you away from doing what you should be doing, then he kind of wins because you won't be doing what you should be doing. And there's a reason why they wanted to go back to Egypt, right? That was what Satan was whispering in their ears. Hey, you should go back to Egypt. It was better there, wasn't it? You don't want to trust God. You want to go back to what you already know. And we have the same thing going on with us where Satan is trying to distract us from doing our mission, from doing what we should be doing, because in doing so, our time and our talents and our resources can be reallocated from being used to accomplish what God is trying to do in and through us to just being used to please number one. And when we just are focused on pleasing number one, focused on ourselves, we will feel the disconnect. We will feel deserted and abandoned, even though it's our doing, not his. Third thing he has to say is they need not fear as they take the promised land. Do not fear and do not be dismayed. The odds don't always look good. Even sometimes when it feels like the bad guys are winning, we don't need to be afraid. God has us. That's kind of the encouragement here is even when you look around, and today, I think you can look around and like, this doesn't look so good around here. What's going on? But we do not need to be afraid. And I suspect in all the individual things that God has called you to personally, whatever your mission in life is or whatever God has woven you to do, teach, love, encourage, serve, like whatever it is that God has called for you to do, that when you start walking down that route, you will see giants. You will see scary stuff that you don't really want to deal with. They're like, how is that possible? Like, God, how is this even possible to do what you've called me to do? Because there is this roadblock, there's this giant in front of me. But we are to take courage, take heart, because God is with us and he can deal with whatever it is that we cannot. God is on our side if we will trust and obey. If we will trust and obey, God is on our side. So here's Moses' teaching in a nutshell for us. Moses' exhortation is that God will be with you, that God will not desert you, and you do not need to fear. Because if you do those things, you will repeat the Exodus' generation's mistake. And that's really what's at stake here, is that Moses is saying, don't do what they did 40 years ago. Don't make that mistake again, okay? And the truth is that we're all subject to that same mistake again of being wandering around for 40 years in this life, not knowing what we're doing because we're not living on mission. We're not trusting and obeying God. If you don't learn the mistakes of history, you're doomed to what? Repeat them, okay? And Moses is saying, don't do it again. Don't be like that Exodus generation. And if you spend some time reading the passages, understanding the story, we all intuitively repeat the same mistakes if we don't trust and obey. So here's, how do we do all this? What do we do with all this here today? There's a very simplistic answer, which is very true, which is very simply trust God. Okay, trust and obey God. But I want to explore this a little bit more because the imagery of the text is so powerful, and it's worth understanding it accurately. Okay, so it's really trust God so that you can cross the Jordan, right? But what does it mean to cross the Jordan? Hopefully you caught that this morning, that what it means to cross the Jordan is to enter into the promised land. And the big question is what does it mean to enter into the promised land? And I've heard many a sermon or many a pastor teach this wrong. They would teach that entering the promised land means going to heaven. I've heard it so many times, and it's so disconcerting because you misunderstand the whole point of the whole thing. Entering the promised land does not mean going to heaven. I mean, just think of Moses. Did Moses make it to the promised land? No, he did not. Did Moses make it to heaven? Yes, he does. And we know that because Jesus talks to him there, the Mount Transfiguration. Moses is there, like he's there, okay? Moses made it, it's okay. He didn't make it to the promised land, but he did make it to heaven. The symbology of the promised land is not heaven, it's something else. What is the symbology of the promised land? Some folks misunderstand it. They suggest, buy guns, move to Israel. And sometimes there's a variation of that, which is kind of popular in certain circles where you buy guns and make America Israel, okay? also not what the passage is trying to say. That was another way of taking it, but that's a proper understanding of the Bible looks for something in particular. It looks for understanding what the original audience, what was intended to the original audience. And you understand what it was meant to them, and then you look for how does that apply to today? What are the universal principles behind it? Okay, so I think you understand what it meant to the original audience. Don't repeat the Exodus generation's mistake again. Don't do it again. Be strong and courageous and trust God. But how do we apply that to today? And this is my summation of it, is that the entering into the promised land means this. It means experiencing the blessings that come from trusting God and obeying Him while living on mission. Entering in the promised land means experiencing the blessings that come from trusting God and obeying Him while living on mission. You and I, we experience intimacy with God. We experience blessings here on earth when we trust God and when we obey Him, right? And this happens when we are living on mission. If we are doing our own thing, if we think that spirituality is not sinning the bad sins and going to church and worshiping on Sunday and then living the rest of our life however we want, pursuing the American dream, we've been confused. Because the American dream is not the mission that God has called us to. And you don't ever arrive to the promised land pursuing the American dream. They're incompatible. Our life is either to be for ourselves or for God. And you kind of have to choose whom you're going to serve, right? That's what Joshua is going to tell the people here in just a little bit. The promised land of blessing comes from a radical faith in God that's accomplishing a radical mission for God here, bringing the gospel of grace to everyone here on earth. And it starts as simply as with your neighbors, teaching them about who Jesus is and what He's done. That is where we experience this blessing here and now. It's not talking about heaven. It's talking about the experience of life on earth, and it comes from trusting and obeying. As a new leader comes, a new pastor comes here to this church, 3 encouragements for you all and Jonathan, if he watches, which I think he might. Number 1, don't be like Israel, okay? Grumbling and complaining, don't do it, okay? Don't practice trusting. Okay, practice trusting. Okay, number 2, be like Caleb and Joshua, trusting that God is able to accomplish His mission through you. And He's able. God has done so much here at this church in the last 5 years while we've been here. We've been so amazed at seeing God at work. But the truth is that you can continue to experience that when you trust and are walking in mission. And lastly, obedience to God matters. Moses missed out on experiencing the promised land because of a lack of obedience. If Moses can fail, we all can fail too. Okay? We have a choice. Obedience is a choice, and obedience looks different for everyone, right? For some people, it might be serving. For others, it might be sharing the gospel. It might be preferring one another. It might be encouraging one another. It might be living in community rather than just being so focused on our own little paradigm. It might be cleaning toilets sometimes. That might be what obedience looks like. It might be raking leaves. It might be giving. This last week here for Christmas, we had 2 services. Big shout out. Thank you for those who came to the 9 o'clock hour. We had if you summed up both hours, we had 194 people here, which is lovely. It's one of our biggest Sundays ever. 194 people fit in this room when we put all the chairs in, but 194 people don't fit in the parking lot, which is kind of one of our challenges. Are we going to get together and obey and get a parking lot expanded or not? It involves giving, involves contributing, and just challenge you. What is God calling you to? What is God calling this church to? You have a choice to obey or to focus on your own stuff. And we all have that choice. We all have that choice every day. There's many, many opportunities. There's many things that God has called you. And I'm not even so bold to tell you what it is exactly that God's calling you to do. The next guy's coming who might have some ideas, but you probably know some things that need to happen too. Do them. Whatever the Lord has called you to do them. Amen?